I'm back. It's not as late as last night. It's only 9:40 and I'm very awake. So hopefully this video will be more interesting. And I have apple cider. Cheers. Constitution is everything, especially in the US politics. I think Obama talks at one point about this sense of patriotism that he has. Because these days I'm leaning a little bit towards anarchy, I have this weird goosebump reaction to anything that's too glorifying, Anything that tries to be too perfect. Do you know what I mean? And I felt like DC is that kind of place, So much of it is a facade. Constitution is something like a facade in some ways, because Obama talks about that. Obama talks about the problems of politics in this chapter. He has certain beliefs about what democracy is and what constitution means. The reality of Washington, D.C. doesn't necessarily reflect that ideal, and thus he's there to implement changes, right? He says at one point, do any of these fights matter? Almost this kind of nihilistic position, right? Kind of feeling tired of these bureaucratic processes, even though, again, I think that's a big part of what democracy is in some ways, right? All these processes are very important to prevent a kind of autocracy, right? And yet, for all our disagreements, we would be hard-pressed to find a conservative or liberal in America today, whether Republican or Democrat, academic or layman, who doesn't subscribe to the basic set of individual liberties identified by the founders and enshrined in our Constitution and our common law. The right to speak our minds, the right to worship how and if we wish, the right to peacefully assemble to petition our government, the right to own, buy, and sell property and not have it taken without fair compensation, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, the right not to be detained by the state without due process, the right to a fair and speedy trial, and the right to make our own determinations with minimal restrictions regarding family life and the way we raise our children. And then he mentions anarchy here. We also understand that a declaration is not a government. A creed is not enough. The founders recognized that there were seeds of anarchy in the idea of individual freedom, an intoxicating danger in the idea of equality. For if everybody is truly free without the constraints of birth or rank or an inherited social order, if my notion of faith is no better or worse than yours, and my notions of truth and goodness and beauty are as true and good and beautiful as yours, then how can we ever hope to form a society that coheres? Enlightenment thinkers like Hobbes and Locke suggested that free men would form governments as a bargain, to ensure that one man's freedom did not become another man's tyranny, that they would sacrifice individual license to better preserve their liberty. And building on this concept, political theorists writing before the American Revolution concluded that only a democracy could fulfill the need for both freedom and order, a form of government in which those who are governed grant their consent and the laws constraining liberty are uniform, predictable, and transparent, applying equally to the rulers and the ruled. I am leaning more towards anarchy these days. Yes, so he mentions anarchy here, as kind of a dangerous idea. He says seeds of anarchy in the idea of individual freedom. And in the way I interpret it is, real sense of freedom is in this idea of anarchy. That's why maybe I'm kind of more towards it. What is anarchy? I mean, I'm reading right now another book, collection of essays by Chomsky. I just think that this idea of democracy only works in a small scale. But most nations are not at that scale. Even here, he admits that considering everything, democracy is the best option. So what I'm saying is democracy in some ways is not an ideal thing, but it is something that is the best thing that we have, which sometimes I feel like is not good enough. So this argument is, I think you can play it both ways. You can play it from his perspective saying, this is why democracy is best, to have both freedom and order. But you can also interpret it as like, oh, this shows how democracy is really not our final destination because it's so imperfect. There's actually quite a good amount of sections to read from here because he's struggling with the importance of constitution versus the reality of how to implement it. As a politician, he struggles with that here. And this chapter is, I think, the one place he mentions also Native Americans. Okay. It's the freedom of the relativist, the rule breaker, the teenager who has discovered his parents are imperfect and has learned to play one off of the other. The freedom of the apostate. And yet, ultimately, such apostasy leaves me unsatisfied as well. Maybe I am too steeped in the myth of the founding to reject it entirely. Maybe, like those who reject Darwin in favor of intelligent design, I prefer to assume that someone's at the wheel. In the end, the question I keep asking myself is why? If the Constitution is only about power and not about principle, if all we are doing is just making it up as we go along, has our own republic not only survived but served as the rough model for so many of the successful societies on earth? So here he goes back to this idea of American exceptionalism. I know I'm mentioning this a lot, but it's true. I think that's the biggest problem I have with this book. He says, maybe I'm too steeped in the myth of the founding. He does admit that to a certain degree, this idea of the founding fathers, Constitution, this great new land, the great new world, is a form of a myth. While much of the Constitution's language is clear and can be strictly applied, our understanding of many of its most important provisions, like the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, has evolved greatly over time. The original understanding of the 14th Amendment, for example, would certainly allow sex discrimination and might even allow racial segregation, an understanding of equality to which few of us would want to return. This makes me think about actually a friend who is dating a Marxist, a proclaimed Marxist, which I find actually quite rare these days, right? And I have nothing against them. His argument was that the fact that people think that democracy won over Marxists is too early to say, because if you think about how long democracy has been around, like in the larger history, then it's really too short of a time to say that it actually succeeded and it works, because now we already see a lot of faults in it. Democracy is this weird, like, seesawing thing. Like, if one person gets off of the seesaw doesn't work, there has to be two sides to have momentum, you know. It was a rejection of all forms of absolute authority. The Constitution itself proved a sufficient defense against tyranny. It's not just absolute power that the founders sought to prevent. Implicit in its structure, in the very idea of ordered liberty, was a rejection of absolute truth. The infallibility of any idea or ideology or theology or ism, any tyrannical consistency that might lock future generations into a single, unalterable course, or drive both majorities and minorities into the cruelties of the Inquisition, the pogrom, the gulag, or the jihad. The founders may have trusted in God, but true to the Enlightenment spirit, they also trusted in the minds and senses that God have given them. They are suspicious of abstraction and liked asking questions, which is why at every turn in our early history, theory yielded to fact and necessity. It may be the vision of the founders that inspires us, but it was their realism, their practicality and flexibility and curiosity that ensured the Union's survival. So essentially, he points out the founding fathers' grounds for the Constitution, that it has to be practical. They're looking at what's happening in front of them in the world, making common law. And flexibility, it's always open to change because society, life, people always change. No one stays the same. And you have to be curious in order to listen. And I think that's important. So he is really a good defender of the founding fathers and Constitution. You know, democracy is all about processes and, you know, not believing in like immediate change. Maybe things don't really change quickly, but that's the point. You know what I mean. Whether we are for or against affirmative action, for or against prayer in schools, we must test out our ideals, vision, and values against the realities of a common life, so that over time they may be refined, discarded, or replaced by new ideals, sharper visions, deeper values. Indeed, it is that process, according to Madison, that brought about the Constitution itself, through a convention in which no man felt himself obliged to retain his opinions any longer than he was satisfied of their propriety and truth, and was open to the force of argument. So the one place where he talks about Native American is here. The Constitution's exquisite machinery would secure the rights of citizens, those deemed members of America's political community, but it proved no protection to those outside the constitutional circle. The Native American, whose treaties proved worthless before the court of the conqueror, or the black man Dred Scott, who would walk into the Supreme Court a free man and leave a slave. We must talk and reach for common understandings, precisely because all of us are imperfect and can never act with the certainty that God is on our side. And yet, at times we must act nonetheless, as if we are certain, protected from error only by providence. The blood of slaves reminds us that our pragmatism can sometimes be moral cowardice. Lincoln and those buried at Gettysburg remind us that we should pursue our own absolute truths, only if we acknowledge that there may be a terrible price to pay. It gets a bit dark there. I think this chapter is quite interesting, this chapter on Constitution, because it's such a core value in American politics. They talk about it all the time, even today, all the time, even in like talk shows all the time. In every issue, they bring up the Constitution, I think. I think the way he talks about it is quite convincing in the sense like he kind of plays both sides. I like that. I mean, oftentimes things are not black and white. There's so much we don't know that to have this common law to judge people, that's a very weighty thing. He tries to restrain from taking an absolute stance, that he is ready to shift depending on situation and specific circumstance. It should never be like no matter what your situation is, this is the law, so we don't want to hear about your story. I think that is the dangerous place to be. In some ways, this chapter reveals a lot about who he is at the center, like what I believe in the core of who I am. The next chapter is politics, talks about, his process, and I think this is the least interesting chapter maybe. I think he talks a lot about like process of him, like a lot about money, raising money, like process of, campaigning, which is blah blah blah. I'm really not interested. In this politics chapter, he is very critical of the media. It actually reminded me the President of the United States now, because he talks a lot about the media. But listen, this is one thing that Obama said. The episode hinted at a more subtle and corrosive aspect of modern media. How a particular narrative, repeated over and over again and hurled enough cyberspace at the speed of light, eventually becomes a hard particle of reality. How political caricatures and nuggets of conventional wisdom lodge themselves in our brain without us ever taking the time to examine them. Is it talking about fake news? Is one analyst more credible than the other? Is there an independent analyst somewhere who might walk us through the numbers? Who knows? Rarely does the reporter have time for such details. The story is not really about the merits of the tax cut or the dangers of the deficit, but rather about the dispute between the parties. After a few paragraphs, the reader can conclude that Republicans and Democrats are just bickering again and turn to the sports page, where the storyline is less predictable and the box scores tells you who won. But at least some of the decline in civility arises from the fact that from the press's perspective, civility is boring. Very critical. Instead, the media is splintered into the 1,000 fragments, with each its own version of reality, each claiming the royalty of a splintered nation. Depending on your viewing preferences, global climate change is or is not dangerously accelerating. The budget deficit is going down or going up. Fake news. I watch the news addictively, but I kind of agree. Because there's so much of it and it's constant. It's 24 hours basically, and the same stories are told in 100 other channels, right? And sometimes you think, is that necessary? Actually, everybody's saying the same thing, but on different channels. So it's not very helpful. Next chapter is opportunity, and he talks a lot about education in this chapter actually, and about actually investing in Americans, investing in people, What kind of opportunities do people want? Let's start with those investments that can make America more competitive in the global economy. Investments in education, science and technology, and energy independence. Actually, recently I watched a YouTube channel about energy independence. There was something about how the US actually could be energy independent. Basically, it said wherever you drill in the US, you will have oil. And so this idea of, chanting energy independence, both Republicans and Democrats, it's kind of ridiculous. And I think it was tied to international relations between the US and the Middle Eastern countries. Sometimes I think in Korea we tend to always look to the US and be like, this is what the US is doing, we should do this. Even Barack Obama is we have so many problems in education. He says America now has one of the highest high school dropout rates in the industrialized world. He's very critical about the educational system in the US. And I went to high school, college, and grad school there. I think the education I got was amazing. I met a lot of good teachers, but it's not a very fair ground for everybody. In that sense, I feel like I'm neglecting the fact that this education is not for all. It's not about greatness. Because something great is venerated, everybody wants to be great, right? Which means everybody has to compete, which means you want more than other people to get to that place. You want more education, you want more money, you want more resources, you want just more. And this greed and desire is crawling inside of you because we live in a place where like things are not everybody has the same playing ground. And in that case, is greatness truly great? And is it actually great for our society? I guess it's a tricky thing. It's hard to break out of the world that we live in, you know? So here at the end of the chapter is when he really makes a strong statement, maybe more a little bit more abstract in some ways, but how do we create good and fair opportunities, and why is that important? I simply believe that those of us who have benefited most from this new economy can best afford to shoulder the obligation of ensuring every American child has a chance for that same success. And perhaps I possess a certain Midwestern sensibility that I inherited from my mother and her parents, a sensibility that Warren Buffett seems to share, that at a certain point one has enough, that you can derive as much pleasure from a Picasso hanging in a museum as from one that's hanging in your den, that you can get an awfully good meal in a restaurant for less than $20, and that once your drapes cost more than the average American's yearly salary, then you can afford to pay a bit more in taxes. More than anything, it is that sense that despite great differences in wealth, we rise and fall together, that we can't afford to lose. As the pace of change accelerates, with some rising and many falling, that sense of common kinship becomes harder to maintain. Jefferson was not entirely wrong to fear Hamilton's vision for the country, for we have always been in a constant balancing act between self-interest and community, markets and democracy, the concentration of wealth and power, and the opening up of opportunity. We've lost that balance in Washington, I think. With all of us scrambling to raise money for campaigns, with unions weakened and the press distracted with lobbyists, for the powerful pressing their full advantage, there are few countervailing voices to remind us of who we are and where we've come from, and to affirm our bonds with one another. He contrasted the concentration of wealth and power with opening up opportunities, meaning when the wealth and power is concentrated, the opportunities are locked to a certain group of people and not opened up to everybody. I mean, how do you balance it? Self-interest and community, markets and democracy, concentration of wealth and power, and the opening up of opportunity. Who's going to let go of their wealth and power to open the opportunity to other people? So I think I have to have a third session on this book because we're only like halfway through. I'm so bad at this. But